Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 35 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, you're leaving me.
I sure am. So in how many days? What is math? Like 5 days?
That's a loaded. We need a guest for that one. What is math? I don't
Nope,
think either of
nope.
us are qualified for that one.
We're avoiding math as much as possible in this podcast, even though math is science or science is math. Whatever. Um, Nobody likes math. Even like mathematicians like this say that they like math. They're lying. So in 5 days or so from now, I am leaving my home state of New York and moving full time to California.
And as much as I would like to have a whole bit on how I'm all ticked off that you were leaving and everything, this really is like awesome for you that you're
I'm
being
very
able to do
excited.
this. Yeah.
Yeah. So and eventually we will have an episode about this, not about me moving, but about the job that I have lined up for when I get out there. But essentially, it's monitoring construction sites for fossils. Because in several Western states, but especially California, you need to have, like, California has laws requiring that construction companies have a paleontologist sort of like on site. They don't have to, they're usually not employed by the construction company. It's usually companies that like specialize in that. But they're just in case you dig something up. And like priority one is to make sure that's not human, because then either law enforcement or archaeologists need to get involved.
Yeah.
And that's much more paperwork, which holds up construction for much longer than a fossil would. So they prefer to have the paleontologists there because the archaeologists cost more and need much more paperwork. So paleontologists are sort of the more just like cost-effective, time-effective option.
This sounds similar to with my summer camp. Every time a camper gets hurt, I've got to fill out some paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, I was able to get all the kids to answer me back whenever we said, "What does Mike not like to do?" And they would all say, "No paperwork," and that would be my way of saying, "Don't get hurt, please," because that just means paperwork.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm very excited.
As you should be, and I am. I'm excited for you. As much as I am going to miss, having you, within driving distance. We didn't see each other all that much when you were around. And this is one hell of an opportunity for you. So
it's also it's also going to be one hell of a drive because
that's what you're doing.
I am driving.
Yep, road trip.
Absolutely,
and driving by yourself, which I'm not sure if that's. But I would like it myself, but I don't know. I don't know how you would like it driving by yourself.
Well, I have started downloading many hours worth of podcasts to listen to on the way. So yeah, it's a 43-hour drive, if anyone was curious. And I'm doing it over 4, potentially 5 days. But yeah, it'll be interesting. That's for sure.
It'll be interesting. Hopefully, it'll be a lot of fun. If you want a podcast that will keep you engrossed the whole time, for anybody else that is listening, if you're into fiction as an audio medium, the podcast "We're Alive" is
interesting.
I think the best thing I've ever listened to. It is
okay.
I was on Reddit one day just browsing like the podcast subreddit, and someone said, "Don't listen to this podcast because it will ruin every other podcast for you," and they were correct. It was
all right.
It is
Mike. You can't tell our audience to go listen to someone else. It's bad marketing.
We've already got them hooked, so I'm fine with that. They have to listen to our podcast to get my recommendation.
Right, but so this is episode 35. What if they just don't come back to episode 36?
We've got a pretty loyal and dedicated audience base, so I'm not worried about that, and I'm sure they're looking forward to us getting into it today. So,
absolutely,
Gavin, we got the calendar?
No, for a couple of reasons. One,
the hell we don't have the calendar.
I mean, it's here. Like it is physically present, but for a couple of reasons. One, the calendar is garbage.
I hate that thing. So I've never even seen the calendar, and I hate that thing.
As we allude to pretty much every week, the calendar's kind of garbage. And so this week I looked at both the weekend before this episode and the weekend afterward. So there were a total of, let's see, that'd be 7, 8, 9 entries. A total of 9 entries. and none of them had anything to do with even loosely with biology, geology, or even some parts of chemistry, which would be interesting to talk about for me. None of them.
Not even a
So
little bit.
nope. So uh, today I'm just going to go on a little tiny rant
Ooh, all
um,
right. I'm into it.
about a piece of paleontological news that has come up in the last week. Particularly, again, just like how it's been covered, because the science itself is actually neat and interesting, but the way that people talk about it is so bad.
This is a media criticism podcast, after all.
Not always, but more frequently than I thought it would be. So, there was a new genus and species of pterosaur. You'll remember we've talked about these at length. They are the things that most people think are dinosaurs, the ones that actually fly that aren't birds.
Mm-hmm.
They have the big long wings, basically what most people call pterodactyls. So there was a brand new kind of them found in Australia, which by itself is really interesting because there's like less than 2 dozen or so different species of pterosaurs known from Australia, like the entire continent. So a new one adds a significant amount of new information just to what these animals look like in Australia. So uh, that by itself is really interesting.
Yeah.
And so a new one was published. It was published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, a very prestigious journal in my field.
I think you've mentioned it before.
Mm-hmm. And so it it's gotten a lot of coverage because apparently this thing had just a giant friggin' noggin, or at least a really big jaw. So this new species, which is called Thapungaka, this is a weird name. Thapungaka? Thapungaka shawi. I don't know
Hmm.
I have known nothing about the etymology of the genus. The shawi part of the species name, that's named after somebody. Um, I would assume that might be some kind of indigenous Australian word, but I don't know that for
Okay.
sure. Um, but so it has a 3.5 foot long jaw, so like lower jaw. That's like this as long as your arm. That's how long its lower jaw was.
That. How long was its upper jaw?
I don't believe that we know.
Okay.
I did not. So you know, fourth wall here or a little disclosure. I've not actually read the full paper.
Right.
I've read several good, well written and informative articles about this interesting pterosaur.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also read several bad ones, which is why we're talking about them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the thing that really bothers me is that I've seen several. This is not just a one. I've seen like a solid, probably close to 10 articles. And the one that I'm picking on specifically here is written on futurism.com under their hard science sort of category of articles. And the headline is
Okay.
Scientists discovered dinosaur fossil that seems suspiciously like a dragon.
Oh, so
That is like the most
that's clickbait. Yep.
clickbaity title I have ever heard. Because the first sentence of this says scientists discovered a new species of pterosaur. So immediately you're acknowledging, okay, it's not a dinosaur. Even though most people do think that pterosaurs are dinosaurs. But it's like if you're writing scientific articles, it is your job. That's literally what you get paid for, to educate people and clear up misconceptions.
And it's what gets me about this is that the people know what they're doing.
Yes, they do.
There's nobody that does that doesn't know exactly what they're doing. But
Mm-hmm.
I have such a high tolerance for honest mistakes and people trying their best and all of that. The people that do that know exactly what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And so the full intro sentence continues. So it says scientists discovered a new species of pterosaur in Australia that, based on its absolutely massive, terrifying jaws, bears shocking resemblance to the mythological creatures known as dragons. I don't know why you need the extra flair. Everybody knows what a dragon is. But it has some real funky teeth, is what they're getting at, essentially. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they're very big, especially at the front of the mouth. They're very big and very pointy.
Right.
Um, but it's like it looks no more like a dragon than any other pterosaur. You know,
Hmm.
from what I can tell, its body is just like that of any other pterosaur.
Right.
So, and it's not even particularly big. Like it would comfortably be like if it were alive today, the largest flying animal today. I guess
Really.
wingspan was like around 22 feet. So like
Hmm.
comfortably the largest flying thing today. Uh, but still not terribly big in terms of pterosaurs. You know, pun not
Okay.
intended. Um, but yeah, it's interesting, and they even like have quotes from some of the authors of the paper, and I'm like, okay, but how'd you screw up this bad? And it's, again, I'm picking on this one in particular because it happened to come across my news thing on Facebook. But
Right, but still, like it,
right,
that,
so it's just very frustrating. That's like that person, if they're a freelance writer, they've got paid like a few $100s to write that article for them,
hmm
and I'm like, okay, but you're not even good at it. How do you even get gigs? Let alone if they're like a staff writer. And I'm like, well, how'd you end up in a staff writer position if you're that? Oh, I'm almost cursed. That friggin' bad at your job, you know? You know?
yeah.
So it's just very frustrating. Anyway, so little rant over.
It always appreciated though. So that takes the place of our calendar for the week. So we're getting into the topic now.
Yes, we are. And this is a really interesting topic
All
because,
right.
so unlike, this is going to be a little bit of a weird episode because when we talk about certain groups, such as like when we did the elephants episode, I talked about modern elephants, and then we sort of went back in time to the start of the elephants group, and then worked back toward the modern, right? We're gonna
Mm-hmm.
sort of do that because today
Okay.
we're talking about mammals, just in general, the whole group.
I'm a fan.
Uh, but we're not going to go all the way to today
Why not?
when we end because that would take far longer than we're going to spend in this episode. That would take a couple hours.
Really?
So we will have another episode at some point, picking up
I
where
mean,
this
you're going to be
left
doing a whole
off.
lot of driving soon, so I think you might use a couple hours of podcast.
But I also can't stand the sound of my own voice, so
Yeah, yeah, fair enough.
um, so we're going to leave off around when the first mammals really show up. So we're going to talk about where mammals came from, essentially, and then
Hmm.
we're going to do another episode that picks up from the first mammals and then goes to today at some
Sure.
point in the future. So obviously, since we're going to be talking a whole lot about them, Mike, what is a mammal?
So a mammal, I feel like everything I say here, like I know like platypus is sort of the exception to every rule with mammals,
Okay.
which, I part of what comes to my head with is like they give live birth, but not
Okay.
all of them.
That
Uh,
is true, except for four species.
right. So that it's one of those things like, okay, clearly that can't be part of the definition of a mammal.
Right.
Um, I feel like breasts are like delivering milk to your young,
Mm-hmm.
through a nipple.
That
Um,
is well. Again, the milk is the big one there
okay,
because
milk.
platypuses don't have nipples.
Why do
They
platypus have
have
nipples?
milk. It just comes out of their skin
Just oozes out of their skin?
in specific spots, but they don't have an actual nipple that like the baby platypus, like
Are we?
drinks from as like a calf would from like its mom cow.
I mean, you might be getting this. Are we sure that platypuses are mammals, considering they're always the exception to this stuff?
That's a whole different conversation.
Oh boy.
Yes, but God, are they weird? They're not the only weird ones because there's echidnas as well. There's only one species of platypus. There are three species of echidna
Mm-hmm.
that they also lay eggs, and so we're going to talk about their group in a bit. But so
Okay.
we have the milk. What else we got?
Is body hair a part of it?
Yes, and those are pretty much the big two that most people pretty much know
Okay.
about mammals.
Is being a vertebrate, is that another one?
Yes, but it's like all mammals are vertebrates, but not all vertebrates are mammals.
Okay, so
You
that might
know,
not be all that helpful.
right? Because it's like lizards are vertebrates,
Mm-hmm.
fish are vertebrates. So
Right. I was gonna say land animals, but I don't actually think that's true. Um,
so
yeah, I
well,
No?
The
I
way
mean,
the way phylogenetics works, understanding how different things are related. Yes, and we will
mhm,
we will also talk about that in a bit.
okay.
But just because there are some that were like, nah, I like water after being on land. Um,
Oh,
well, like whales.
right.
Whales were terrestrial at one point. We will
Yes.
have a whale episode coming eventually because whale
Mhm.
evolution's so freaking cool. Uh, but yes, all mammals were at one point in their lineage terrestrial.
Okay. I'll give myself a little credit for that one.
Yeah.
Um, I'm
So
trying to think if
I'll
I
give you one more thing because the two big ones were the hair and the milk.
okay. I think that's about as far as I'm
Okay,
gonna get myself here. So what am I leaving out here? Is it let me ask you this, is it an obvious one or one I'm gonna know?
probably. Um,
Okay.
well, Grant, I have a whole list because mammals are so weird compared to every other group of vertebrates, or at least tetrapods, which we'll talk about in a
Uh-huh.
minute. Um, so those are the most obvious ones. The other ones that will sound very obvious once you think about it, but like warm-bloodedness,
Okay.
called endothermy. Although there are some mammals that have since lost it, like naked mole rats are like barely endothermic.
Oh.
Um, and also there are many different kinds of reptiles and even some fish that are like partially endothermic. So it's not like either you are cold blooded or you are warm blooded. It's kind of a spectrum.
And I think we talked about that in our reptiles episode, if I remember correctly.
Yes, we did. Um, but so just to sort of give a little bit of like the taxonomy here, mammals are vertebrates, meaning we have bones, on the inside. We are tetrapods, meaning that we have four limbs, even ones that have lost them, like snakes and whales, which don't have, back limbs. They're still tetrapods because their ancestors had them. And we are amniotes. We, as in mammals, are amniotes, meaning that we do not need water for our eggs, essentially. So, other than the obvious two, the milk and the hair, some things that
Mm-hmm.
are unique to mammals or like semi unique to mammals, and I'll sort of qualify which ones are like semi unique when I bring them up. So, one that the only like really obvious one that like you probably don't think about and nobody would like very few people would actually say this. Once it's pointed out, you're like, oh yeah, is that ears? Only mammals have external ears.
What?
So that most animals have ears, but if you think of like the fleshy bit that's made out of cartilage on you and your cat and your dog, no other animals have that. Those are actually called pinnae.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That is why the ear. That's sort of.
Well, like
Wow.
so
All right.
I have a pet lizard, and she has ears, but they're just kind of holes in her skull.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I'm thinking like a snake right now, and it's a similar kind of thing.
well, snakes don't actually have ear
Wait,
openings at
really?
all. Snakes do not have ear openings at all.
Oh.
Um, yeah, snakes are weird, but if you think of like a frog, how they have sort of just like the thing on the side of their head.
Yep.
That thing on the side of their head is literally their eardrum,
Mm-hmm.
as far as I am aware. Um, so yeah, it's interesting that mammals are the only ones with that. But the rest of these things are things that you would not know because they're mostly internal things. So mammals have a single bone in their jaw, whereas things like lizards, so all of your lower jaw, at least on each side, your left side and your right side, each half is one single bone. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
in, amphibians, reptiles, it's made up of several different bones, including the one that we have, but in addition to many others. Our long bones, which are mostly your bones in your arms and legs,
Right.
they have growth caps called epiphyses that eventually will sort of seal to the ends of your bones once you're past puberty. Essentially, we hold our legs under our body, unlike sort of a lizard, which sort of hold them sort of out to the side, sort of sprawling.
I
Mammals
was
hold
sort of
them
thinking. I was
much
definitely
more under
thinking
themselves.
I was gonna say like walking upright or
Hmm.
something, and then I started thinking about like whales and dolphins and stuff. But like
Right.
you said, at one point, that's what they did.
Hmm.
So
And
yep.
this is not unique to mammals. For example, dinosaurs we know did this. Crocodilians, most of them, not all of them, do this. Um, It's mostly just an adaptation for being heavy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in addition to mammals sometimes just doing it because. So like the first mammals were not all that big, uh, but it's a much more efficient way of walking if you are warm blooded, which we'll get back to. Um, Mammals have three inner ear bones, as opposed to anything else that has inner ear bones only having one. We'll definitely talk about that in a bit.
Okay.
Mammals have a secondary palate, which basically is the roof of your mouth. So, in every other group of animals, so there's mammals, and then crocodilians have this too. Completely unrelated though. It's different bones that make up the palate, but when you breathe in, it doesn't go into your mouth through your nose. It goes into your sinuses, right?
I'll
And
take your word for it.
well, like if you breathe in through your nose, you don't feel the air gushing in your mouth, right?
Correct. Yes.
In say frogs, when they breathe in through their nose, it goes into their mouth.
Oh, okay.
So they're breathing through their nose and breathing through their mouth is basically the same. Mammals have
Hmm.
this adaptation to be able to eat while breathing, or
Okay.
at least chew while breathing. Mostly, it's probably to be able to drink milk from your mother while still breathing.
Okay.
Crocodilians have this so that they can be chomping on stuff and still breathe, or hold things underwater while potentially poking their nose above the water.
Yep.
But it's made of completely different bones that sort of border between like the sinuses and your mouth. Um, Mammals have heterodont teeth, which we've talked about before. How mammals have differentiated teeth. Your teeth in the front of your mouth are different than the teeth in the back of your mouth. No, most other animals don't have that. Mammals have two occipital condyles, which are the part of your skull where it meets the first vertebra in your neck. It's basically two like bulbs on either side of where your spinal cord enters your skull.
Am I able to feel that?
No,
Okay.
nope, that is directly where it contacts the vertebra.
Gotcha.
And other animals, except for amphibians, um, all other animals have one. Amphibians also have two, but also unrelated, like with the crocodile thing. It's weird. I don't know why amphibians do that. But the original amphibians, like the common ancestors that we have with frogs, had one. So both mammals and frogs and salamanders, got two of these independently. We're the only animals that have ribs on only some of our vertebrae. So if you notice, your ribs stop about halfway down your torso, and then the
Mm-hmm.
ones sort of where your stomach is, your vertebrae don't have ribs. In pretty much everything else, they do. Um, so like we have a whole different kind of vertebrae. We have your thoracic vertebrae, which are the ones with ribs, and your lumbar vertebrae, which are the ones without ribs. Uh, like reptiles don't have lumbar vertebrae. All of them have ribs. At least they might be real small, but they still have them.
Right.
Um, Mammals are really famous for having lots of glands in their skin, mostly sweat glands, and they're called sebaceous glands, which basically secrete different oils and things. And it's actually from these sebaceous glands that we think that milk glands ended up like being derived from. The way mammals breathe is real different. We have a diaphragm, that thing that you don't think about, that like that sheet of muscle below your ribs.
Yeah, it's what
Uh,
singers have to use.
exactly. Lots of different reptiles do things very differently. Reptile breathing is very complicated. I'm not going to go into it, but trust me, they don't have a diaphragm. So that is unique to mammals. Um, Mammals have what's called a corpus callosum. And actually, some mammals, monotremes, which are the egg laying ones, and marsupials, don't have this, but it's a layer of tissue that connects your left side of your brain to your right side of your brain much more quickly and enables sort of higher, I don't want to say like higher thinking because that's weird, but it just enables the sides of your brain to be able to communicate better. And then this is just one that I'm going to throw in and not talk about again because I don't know enough about it. But some mammals have what's called a baculum, which
A
is,
baculum.
yes, and keep in mind this is a science podcast, and I'm just going to mention this and move on. It is a bone in the penis. Humans do not have this. Many, many, many other mammals do. Um, so moving on, but no reptiles or amphibians have that. Just mammals. So
Hmm.
now we're going to talk about. So those are. I could keep going. That I talked for like I don't know 5 minutes at least about things unique to mammals. I could keep going. Mammals are super super weird compared to everything else.
Now, hold on. You say mammals are super, super weird compared to everything else.
Hmm.
Is it that mammals are super weird compared to everything else, or everything is really weird compared to everything? Like, if we talked about any group, they would be super weird compared to everything else. Or is it mammals really are specifically an odd bunch?
I think I would say that mammals are odd because, and I say that mostly to mean that like all reptiles share a more recent common ancestor with each other
Hmm.
than they do with mammals. So they are more closely related, which is why they have more in common.
Okay.
So mammals are the odd ones out because we are more evolutionarily distant from statistically most vertebrates.
Gotcha. So mammals are a lot more insular when they're the way they've evolved.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
So we have three modern groups of mammals. We have your monotremes, which are the egg-laying ones. One species of platypus and three species of echidna. They kind of look like hedgehogs with a much more like anteater type snout.
Hmm.
Um, but all of them live in Australia. They used to be a lot more common, but there's only four of them today. So they are a complete separate group. And then we have the therian mammals. Within that, we have the metatheria. So theria, you'll hear quite a bit throughout this, or sort of the THER suffix or prefix. That means beast in, I believe, Latin. Um, so we have the metatherian mammals, which are your marsupials and their cousins. You know, things like your kangaroos, possums, wombats, etc. And then we have the eutherians, or the true beasts, which are your placental mammals, mammals that have a placenta, you know, such as you, your cat, your dog, elephants, whales, hippos, horses, whatever. Most mammals you're thinking of are eutherian mammals. But to understand how we got mammals, we need to go back way before mammals existed to when the first vertebrates kind of came on land. Because, you know, we got to figure out how, you know, the steps changed to get from these things to the things, all these things that I talked about in how mammals are weird. So
Okay. So we're going back a little ways.
we're going back to around 380 million years ago in the late Devonian period.
That's still wild to me. When I thought we were going back to at least like a billion years ago, and then I
Oh
remembered
no,
that life didn't really begin, or at least multicellular life didn't really begin until like a billion years ago. Am I correct in that?
even sooner than that.
Yeah, like that's like
Like the first evidence of like real multicellular, well, depending on there, a recent paper came out like literally last week, which was super neat, but still I'm a little skeptical of some sponges from like 890 million years ago, which like
it's
extends the range of sponges by like 300 million years at
quite a
least.
bit. It's still anyway. My point was just that it's
Right.
like it is.
More
Obviously
recent
hundreds
than
of
you'd think it'd be.
yes, it is hundreds of millions of years, and that is a long time. But still, like in the time span of the Earth, like
Hmm.
not as long as you might originally think.
Right.
Anyways, I apologize for interrupting.
No, that's okay. And like there had been things on the land before this, you know, arthropods, you know, things like scorpions, insect relatives, and some plants had been on land for um, a few dozen million years at this point, at least, maybe even sort of pushing 100, depending on which, you know, evidence you're looking at. But anyway, when our ancestors came onto land was around 380 million years ago. So those were the first tetrapods, you know, those vertebrates with four limbs.
Okay.
So this would be animals like Tiktaalik, which is a very, very famous, often called fishapod, because it shows many, many traits that are both fishy and also tetrapod. Where
Hmm.
they had legs, but they were like barely recognizable.
Did they function in a similar way?
They might have been able to do push-ups, and that's about the extent of what they probably could use them for.
Okay.
Um, and like that whole transition, we're straight up skipping the rest of that. but because that's a whole novel in and of itself. It's actually a really good book about the discovery of that particular species, Tiktaalik. It's called Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin, who I believe is a professor at the University of Chicago, if I remember correctly. Yes, it's called Your Inner Fish. Wonderful book. If you have not read it and would like to read more sciencey things, excellent place to read. So,
What's the name of that book again?
Your Inner Fish, and it basically
Your
goes
Inner Fish.
from how this whole thing of tetrapods coming on land to like how you are literally a fish, as we've talked about before on this podcast. But yeah, so we're gonna fast forward there. I just want to give you that timestamp. About just shy of 400 million years ago is when
Okay.
our ancestors started sort of stumbling on land. So we're gonna fast forward to the late Carboniferous period now. So we move up about 70 million years to around 312 million years ago.
Okay.
And for those roughly 70 million years in between, when we see the first ones coming on land to this time, vertebrates were still pretty much tied to water. They were much more land adapted. They could come onto land. They didn't need to live in water. They had full lungs. They could support themselves on land pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
But they were still tied to water because they couldn't lay eggs on land. They still
Okay.
had eggs very much like frogs and salamanders, where they were just kind of this gooey thing that had a couple layers but could not retain any water itself. So if the pond that they were laid in dried up, those embryos died.
So the animals themselves could be on the land, but they couldn't stray that far away from a reliable, water source, body of water.
Right.
Okay.
Until
Okay.
around this time, around 312 million years ago, when the first amniotes show up. Amniotes, as we've talked about in probably a good number of episodes in this podcast, are the animals that can lay eggs outside of water, that lay shelled eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And they're called amniotes because the sort of outer layer, not quite the shell, but like the next inside layer of an egg that helps retain the water is called the amnion. You might have heard of like amniotic fluid.
Yep.
That is what retains the water inside an egg.
Okay.
So there's a really important problem to discuss with this group when it comes to them being fossils. And I want to ask Mike if he can sort of see the problem with having this being the defining characteristic of amniotes.
That they have a shell that can retain water. Am I getting that correct?
That they lay eggs that can retain water. Yeah.
That defining character. The only thing that's coming to mind is that you're defining a species based on like the way it produces its offspring, but the species itself might be more or less unchanged. Although even as I'm saying that, like the way you produce offspring is a pretty specific change. So, oh,
I
is
just
it?
I just wanted to test you as well as the audience if you could think of it as well.
Yeah, that's. Can you ask
But
the question one more time? Just I want to make sure I'm
so
understanding the question you're
basically, just
asking.
the problem with defining a fossil group of animals based on them laying eggs that don't that retain water.
I have one more guess based on
Okay.
just the way you rephrase that.
Okay.
Does it have something to do with the fact that those eggs not fossilizing very well, and so we're sort of taking a stab in the dark in terms of defining it?
That would be exactly right.
Oh, okay. It took me. I need you to say that a couple of times, but
Mm-hmm.
just the way you just said it was able to get me there.
And so eggs in general don't fossilize horribly well. So, and the problem is, if you just get the animal, you have no idea what kind of eggs it lays. If you just see the bones of the animal, how that animal could give live birth for all you know, right? We have a big problem. It took us a very long time to figure out that many, like secondarily aquatic reptiles, like mosasaurs, gave live birth. We thought they still somehow hauled themselves up on land and laid eggs. So,
Really?
mhm. But
Huh.
we now are very confident. In fact, I'm pretty sure we have evidence of like pregnant mosasaurs. Um,
Ooh.
But it took us a while to find that evidence. But if they lay eggs, not only could the eggs not fossilize, but what type of egg an animal lays has nothing to do with the bones that it leaves behind, mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So was a big problem with this group. But this group does have some other things that scientists mostly use today to define this group, and that's mostly mostly a lot of things with the skull. They lose a lot of bones in the skull. If you've ever seen a fish skull, it's got a ton of bones.
Right.
So many bones, especially compared to a mammal. Mammals just were like, all these bones, I don't need them. I only need a handful, compared to like a few dozen different ones in a fish skull.
Mm-hmm.
So by this point, we see a good amount of loss of different bones in the skull. But we also see sort of a change in shape of the skull. So there are these things in the back of the skull called otic notches, which, long story short, instead of like a skull being sort of flat across the back, think of like an alligator skull, how it's kind of triangle shaped if you're looking at it from
Mm-hmm.
above. So
Right.
in amphibian type things and things that still needed water, they have this thing called the otic notch, which, so not quite at sort of the base, the back part of the skull that makes the triangle. At not quite the points at the end of that, there'd be like a little indent or notch, which we think is where a place where they could have taken in water to breathe through gills. So by this point, that's gone.
Right.
And we know for sure by this point, okay, if they don't have that, they're not breathing water, they're fully breathing air.
Got to be breathing air.
Yep. And also they have the presence of what's called the astragalus bone in their ankle. So if you feel your own ankle, the inside sort of bump on like the inside part of your foot, the one that kind of sticks out,
Yep.
that is your astragalus bone.
That's a fun name.
Yeah. It's also often called the talus in human anatomy. For some reason, people who do human anatomy give bones different names than they are in other animals. I don't understand it, but
That's
in
unnecessary.
yeah, it really is. In non-human animals, that's called the astragalus.
Okay.
So that bone shows up for the first time in amniotes. So that's sort of the definition, or at least like anatomical pieces that most scientists go with for amniotes. And so almost immediately after we see the first amniotes, we see the group split into two main subgroups of amniotes. There's sort of like a third minor subgroup called anapsids, and so all three of these groups are defined by a particular hole or two or none in the back of their skull behind their eye, called an antorbital fenestra. Or I'm sorry, wow, I'm totally blanking. Temporal fenestra. There it is. Antorbital fenestra is in front of the eye. Temporal fenestra
You could have had
is
me fooled either way.
right, but I want to be correct. So the temporal fenestra is sort of a hole behind the eye, like as in posterior to it. If you're looking at it from the side, it is to the back of the skull from the
Right.
eye. One small subgroup called anapsids don't have a hole. We used to think this is where turtles used to be, because turtles are very weird, even for reptiles. They're very odd. We used to think that this is where turtles came from because turtles don't have this. We now are very confident that they used to have it, but it closed up at some point. And so they actually belong to one of the two major branches called Sauropsida. Basically, saur meaning lizard. So this is where
Right.
pretty much everything that you would call a reptile fits. They have two, one sort of on top of the other, behind the eye in the skull. And this is everything from your lizards, snakes, birds, crocodilians, turtles, everything, with a couple exceptions that we will talk about, that you would call a reptile that you can think of in like as a fossil is in this group.
Okay.
Then we have the synapsida, or synapsids as we'll call them, which only have one. And this is where we are. We are synapsids. And I actually had to look, because my first thought, and like I did learn this at some point, but I'd kind of forgotten it. your first thought would be like, okay, if I have a hole in my skull, where would that be? Your first thought would be like your temple, right?
Uh, My first thought was in the back, but yeah, temple would make sense.
That's not where it is. It's actually weirdly like tucked under your cheekbone, kind of.
What? Under
Yeah,
both of my
it's
cheekbones?
yes. There's one on each side.
What?
Anywho, moving
It's
on.
just weird.
So the sauropsids turned into many, many different lineages, but the ones we have today, like I said, would be modern reptiles, turtles, squamates, which are your snakes and lizards, tuataras, which are a weird group related to lizards but not lizards, crocodilians, and birds. Synapsids eventually became us, but we are not there yet because there are many steps in between the first synapsids and us. So both of these lineages, the one hole and the two hole, sort of just vibe. They're just kind of there. Obviously
Right.
things happen, but no major sort of changes happen for another 10 or so million years to around the start of the Permian period, 299 million years ago. And during the Permian period, synapsids, our lineage, take off in a huge way. They do extremely, extremely well and become the most diverse and really dominant group in pretty much every niche that you can think of, at least like on land. And at the beginning, they were still very reptile looking. But as we talked about I don't even remember what episode it was. I need to do better about remembering what episode was what. But when we talked about why the term reptile is garbage, it's because these look very much like reptiles. If you saw one, you would call it a reptile, but it's not.
Right.
Reptiles are in the other group, the two-holed group, because these are much more closely related to us than they are to lizards or crocodilians. So they still look very reptile-like, though. And they became the top predators of the world, and very importantly, major herbivores, which is really, really important because there hadn't really been a large amount of terrestrial herbivores up until this point.
Mm-hmm.
Because plants are hard to digest, and they do that on purpose. There had been herbivorous insects and arthropods and things on land for a while, but these were the first. It had taken almost, over 100 million years since the first tetrapods came on land to the first tetrapods majorly like focusing on eating plants,
Mm-hmm.
which is crazy. So, but the first, tetrapod herbivores were synapsids. And so the things that, some names that you might recognize, one that you probably have seen 100 times, is called Dimetrodon. It looks very much like a Komodo dragon, but with a big old sail on its back. Everyone calls it a dinosaur. It's not. It's not even a reptile. That's on our lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And some other names you might recognize would be Edaphosaurus. Similar, also with a very big sail, but this one ate plants instead of meat. And then Moscops is one of my favorites just because it's got this absolutely tiny, tiny head relative to a relatively big body. But you'll often hear this group of synapsids called mammal-like reptiles. Because up until relatively recently, I'd say in the last 20 years or so, even though we probably knew that we came from somewhere in this group, they still look like reptiles,
Right.
So we just called them what they look like until people were like, okay, stop using the word reptile, it's bad. So now what you'll hear this group called is stem mammals or proto mammals,
Proto
because
mammals.
that is much more accurate.
Okay.
Although I will say, I will unintentionally confuse us in a little bit for reasons that I'll explain when we get there. Little preemptive confusion. I'm sorry.
All right.
So around 25 million years into the Permian period, so we're now at around 275 million years ago, a new group shows up called the Therapsids. So this is a subgroup within synapsids. So this is still on our lineage, but
Right.
these, as I mentioned earlier, the ther in this means beast. And that basically just means that they're becoming more mammal-like. For some reason, people who give names to things, like beast means mammal, I guess. Like, I don't know of
Y-
any reptiles with that sort of root in their name anywhere.
Okay.
So if you ever hear a scientific name with like ther in their name or therium in its name, it's a mammal.
Hmm.
But yeah, so these therapsids likely came from something closely related, but probably not Dimetrodon, the big Komodo dragon-esque thing with the sail. So not from that, but a close relative to that.
Okay.
And this group is generally much more mammal-like than ones like Dimetrodon were,
In what way?
in that their teeth were starting to differentiate. Dimetrodon actually means two formed teeth or two shapes
Okay.
of teeth. So Dimetrodon was starting to get some tooth differentiation. But once we get into the therapsids, we see like the first like actual canine teeth. We see incisors starting to become more sort of flat and chisel-y shaped. Actually, some therapsids actually had two canines on each side instead of the one that every mammal has today. It was a real weird time. So uh, it's mostly the front of the mouth that starts to differentiate a bit first, and then as time goes on, it becomes more sort of the front chisely ones, the couple sharp ones being your canine and your premolars, and then your flat, chewy ones, the molars.
Right.
Their limbs start to shift much more from Dimetrodon still having them pretty much out to the side like you imagine a lizard, to being more underneath the body and holding the body up off of the ground instead of sort of like belly dragging like some
You said
lizards
these were
kind of
called
do.
the proto mammals.
Yes.
This seems like a good name for them because it seems like a lot of those characteristics you were mentioning before are starting to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't quite there yet. But like you could see it happening.
Right.
That seems like a really appropriate name for what we're talking about here.
Exactly. And this is a really just beautiful illustration of evolution and how evolution works. Because we see people are like very often a criticism of people who disagree with evolution but don't actually understand evolution. Um, will be like, we don't have any transitional fossils. I'm like, okay, if you're looking at, we don't have fossils of species A becoming species B. We do, but not many. But if you look at long-term trends, we have many very beautiful transitions that are very well documented.
Hmm.
And this is one of them. Actually, this is
On a,
many of them.
on maybe not from species A to B, but from species A to Q.
Right.
Okay.
So, like I said, their limbs were becoming much more underneath them, like many mammals hold them today. And there's some potential big asterisk evidence that they may have had some kind of endothermy, meaning warm blood, at this point,
Hmm.
at least in this therapsid group.
Okay.
And some of that evidence is a piece of anatomy called the turbinates, which, if you've ever seen a skull, particularly of like a dog, and seen all of those like squiggly bones like inside, if you look in like from the front of it inside its nose, all those sort of very thin walled bones, those are turbinates. Um, Essentially, what a big function of them is conditioning air that you breathe in before it goes to your lungs. That implies that you're keeping your lungs at a different temperature than the air that you're breathing in.
What's so? What's the purpose of that? Keeping the air in your lungs at different temperature than the air you're breathing.
Basically, if you're outside in the winter, Mike, you live in Syracuse.
This is
Um,
true.
if you breathe through your mouth in the winter, your lungs don't like it. Your
I
your
will confirm that.
your lungs don't like it.
Although it
Uh,
can feel nice sometimes, but generally a
right, but
bad
that's
idea.
not generally great for you either because it can freeze and kill some cells in your lungs. If you breathe through your nose, your turbinates warm up and moisten the air, uh, so that your lungs are happier with
Mhm.
the air. It is better suited to the kind of conditions that your lungs like to get the most oxygen out of the air.
Okay.
So it implies that they're having warm blood, basically, that their body temperature is warmer than the air around them. They have
Okay.
highly
That's
vascularized bones, which is just generally a sign of a more active metabolism, generally meaning warm blood. Something that I saw but didn't see a ton of evidence for. Like, it makes sense, but I didn't see it referenced much. But most of them had relatively short tails, which might have helped conserve heat, just like less surface area to lose heat from.
mm-hmm.
Like, intuitively makes sense, but
Right.
sure. And you'll often see members of this group in paleo art, like art of fossil species, depicted with hair. I don't know of any significant evidence that at least the early ones had hair. We've seen some coprolites, fossil poop of that contains what we're pretty sure is hair from a little bit later. So some of them might have had hair, but not the super early ones.
And these are also the proto mammals, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And so the way that I've had many members of this group, the therapsids, described to me is it looked like a Komodo dragon's sort of best impersonation of a few different types of mammals, like wolves and cats. So it's like if a Komodo dragon put on a fursuit and pretended to be a wolf, that's kind of what some of these look like.
Are Komodo dragons mammals?
No.
Okay.
They are squamates. They are lizards.
Gotcha.
So, around 260 million years ago now, a group of therapsids show up called cynodonts. And this is the group that directly leads to modern mammals. But if we have sort of talked about the Permian period before, that might ring a bell to many listeners.
Yeah.
And at the end of the Permian period, life gets real bad. If you are unfamiliar, this is the end Permian mass extinction at around 250 million years ago.
Feel like we've talked about this a few times.
We've talked about this many times because it's a very important part of history of life on Earth. And it kills anywhere from 90 to 95 percent of all species on Earth, including all of the non-therapsid synapsids. So the more reptile-looking ones, more like Dimetrodon, and not like these, more mammal-like ones.
Mm-hmm.
But in the aftermath of this extinction, some therapsids actually do pretty well. For example, there is one particular therapsid that in a formation in South Africa from like directly after the extinction, this genus called Lystrosaurus makes up 95% of all vertebrate fossils in this particular bed. So it's like, and that's not an isolated thing. Like Lystrosaurus basically took over the planet for like a million years or so.
Good Lord.
And this was not a small animal either. This was like big dog sized, like big dog sized.
What made this thing so special? Why did it get to take over the world?
It was very opportunistic. So it belonged to a group of therapsids called dicynodonts, and there are actually only 3 groups of therapsids that made it across this extinction that survived. Because we're now in the Mesozoic era, in the Triassic period. And so of the 3, there were the dicynodonts, which were mostly herbivorous, and they had like a beak in the front, sort of like a turtle beak.
Right.
And then on either side of the beak, their canine tooth turned into like this little tusk that sort of curved downward in front of the beak. I think I've seen several places that they use that to like dig up roots and things, and use the beak to like chop up the roots.
I assume that's all speculation, right? Informed speculation.
You can see some like wear patterns on the beak that implies that it's eating pretty tough things.
Okay.
But that's probably some kind of informed speculation.
Hmm.
But, with not many plants available on the surface because they all died, there's still lots of roots and things. So if you can dig up the roots and eat the roots, I mean, you're probably having a good time. So yeah, so
Okay.
that's possibly why Lystrosaurus did real well. Um, so that's the Dicynodonts. Another one of the three groups are the Therocephalians, which means beast face, which I think is really funny. Um, these were sort of larger carnivorous ones. Not like huge, obviously not even close to dinosaur size, but like comfortably like wolf or a little bigger. So uh, that's two of the three, and then obviously the group that we are part of, we are Cynodonts. We are members of this group. They
Yeah,
make it
of course.
across too.
Cyanodonts. Yeah, yeah, cyanodonts. I knew that word.
Well, I mentioned them earlier that they show up like right before the extinction.
Right, 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 right.
Um, and sort of
So they show up before the extinction, and they're able to make it past.
yes,
Okay.
they show up about 10 million years before the extinction.
Wow.
And they are sort of small, sort of rodent like. Obviously, rodents don't exist at this point in time. Um, but they're what you would look at it and be like, that's a weird looking rat. That would be the probably, or like a possum, probably, because most of them were probably around possum sized.
I would definitely identify it as a rodent, even if I wasn't sure what the rodent
Right.
was. Okay.
Even though, like I said, these are not rodents. Rodents would not exist for a couple over 100 million years.
Okay.
But we're not going to get to that point in this episode. So cynodonts were omnivorous. They were opportunistic. Some of them were carnivorous. Some of them were insectivorous, eating bugs and things. Some of them were omnivorous, could eat pretty much anything. And then at the beginning, immediate, like sort of post-extinction, synapsids kind of remain in most of the major niches. The big carnivores, big herbivores, sort of middle-sized omnivore things. But fairly quickly after the extinction, the archosaurs take over. This is the group that includes your crocodilians and their relatives, including at this point in time many like large terrestrial archosaurs and crocodilian relatives, as well as your dinosaurs are also in this group.
Mm-hmm.
So they very quickly take over during the Triassic period. And the Therocephalians, the carnivorous group of the three that made it through the big extinction, they go extinct only about 20 million years into the Triassic, so they don't last super long. The Dicynodonts, the ones with the beak and the tusks, they went
Right.
extinct sometime before the end of the Triassic, so they hung around for a little longer, but not too much longer,
Mm-hmm.
leaving the Cynodonts as the only group of synapsids left.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And Cynodonts, throughout the entire Triassic, sort of get progressively smaller and smaller because they were, I'd say, maybe like, and again, this is me complete spitballing here, maybe like medium dog sized. I think there were some larger members as well, but on average, like medium dog sized at the beginning of the Triassic. But as the Triassic goes on, they get progressively smaller and smaller to look much more possum sized, or even smaller than that. And they also become much more mammal like, including by the end of the Triassic, we see the first members of the group called mammaliaforms showing up,
Mammaliaforms.
which literally just means like mammal shape. I'm pretty sure is what that technically means. So
What is
these
a
are
mammal
not
shape?
basically, it's just the name that they
Okay.
give them. So it's basically like much more mammal like, even more mammal like members of this group.
Okay.
So around this time in the late Triassic, we see many significant changes that bring us sort of nearly full circle to mammals. The dentary, which is the bone that currently makes up our jaws, the single bone that we talked about at the beginning, that bone has slowly been taking up more and more real estate in the jaw until around this time when it just completely takes over and makes up the entire jaw.
Finally
And
made the jump.
exactly. And this is really important because this is something that absolutely blew my mind when I learned it. So all other tetrapods articulate, so sort of attach their skull or their jaws to their skull sort of differently than mammals do.
Really?
Hmm.
And how does that work?
So, like I said, the or everything else has more bones in their jaw than mammals do, right?
Right?
So the bone in the jaw that connected to the skull in everything but mammals is called the articular. Makes sense. That's where it articulates.
Sure.
And so the articular bone sort of attaches to the quadrate bone that's a bone in the skull. So those are the two bones that touch at the jaw hinge, basically.
Mm-hmm.
In mammals, that's not how it works. And this is a fascinating piece of transition that I wish I understood better to be able to tell you all about, because I don't think that we know like science. I'm sure that there are people who know much more about it than I do, obviously. Um, but it's a very weird transition, including at some point potentially there being two different points where the jaw had a hinge, like your jaw the at this transition between switching from that one to the one that we currently have,
Mm-hmm.
where the jaw had two hinges on each side,
Okay.
right? Weird.
Something about that seems off, but I'll trust you.
Well, and the reason that they had to do that was because now our dentary, which again makes up our entire jaw, in mammals connects to the squamosal bone in the jaw or in the skull. So you'll notice both of the bones are different. The one in the skull that attaches to the jaw, and the one in the jaw that attaches to the skull. And with mammals, like I said, mammals are just like all these bones in the skull, we don't need them. Except for a couple. The quadrate bone, which is the one that's in the skull that attached to the jaw, and the articular, the one in the jaw that attached to the skull, both of those became the other two inner ear bones that mammals have.
Say that one more time.
The jaw joint that
Yeah.
reptiles have got converted to become inner ear bones for us, because reptiles have one inner ear bone and we have three. So
Wow.
those two bones
Wow.
got turned into little tiny ear bones to help us hear better.
That's and I'm not gonna remember the names, but like those, is that like the hammer thing in your ear
Yes.
that allows you to? Wow,
And
that was a
I
jaw.
yes, not the whole jaw.
Like the part of it.
Yes.
Oh,
And I, for the life of me,
evolution's sweet, man.
I will never remember which one turned into which. I've had to take tests where this was a question and I got them wrong. So I don't know which one became which. Which whether, so the three ear bones are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, which you
Hmm.
might have heard of. The hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, I believe, is how the stapes
Hmm.
is commonly referred to. So I don't. The stapes is there in everything. Amphibians have it. Snakes. Actually, I don't know. I believe snakes do, but snakes are real weird with their skull. Moving on.
Right.
Crocodilians have it. Birds have it. They all have it. They don't have a malleus or an incus, and I don't know which bone turned into the malleus or the incus, but both of them turned into those two bones,
Okay.
which is absolutely crazy.
Yeah. No, that's wild.
And we have the transitional fossils for this. And if we had more time, I would nerd out about this for another 20 minutes or so. But at this point, you'll notice most of the things that I sort of talked about that are unique to mammals have already kind of shown up. They've got different teeth. They've got hair at this point. Milk is a really hard thing because, like the eggs, it's a gland.
Right.
That's not really going to fossilize. So that's something really hard. But we know for sure they had hair. We're pretty sure that they were warm-blooded. At this point, they have their legs held underneath them. They have differentiated teeth. Most of the things that make mammals unique showed up by this point. Very piecemeal. So it's not like you just flip a switch and suddenly it's a mammal now. It's very, very gradual.
Right. It takes time. It took time for these things to all come.
Exactly. And just as sort of these mammalia forms show up, guess what else starts really taking off in the world?
Oh,
So
I actually don't know.
this is the Triassic period.
Would it be dinosaurs?
It sure would.
Okay. I was trying not to look at our notes as you said that.
Okay.
So
But yeah, so dinosaurs really start taking off around the middle to late Triassic. And they obviously, as we all know, took over the world. And but in the middle Jurassic, so by this point around 200 and that's not quite the right time that I have in my notes here. By the middle Jurassic, the first true mammals show up. And so
and what defines those true mammals?
that is an excellent question.
Okay.
Because as with any sort of line, it is real. As with most of these critters, presumably, it's pretty fuzzy.
Right. Okay. So there somebody or a group of scientists, this is where we're putting the line, and this is what we're calling true mammals.
Yeah.
Would I recognize it as a mammal if I saw it?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. They would look very rodent-like. Again, rodents would not exist for still probably 100 million years, at least. Maybe a little less than 100, but anywho, it's right. So mammals were really, really diverse even before any of the modern mammal groups showed up. There's one particular group that I will talk about, I'm sure, a lot in the sort of part 2 to this episode that we do eventually, called the multituberculates.
Multituberculates.
Yes, they are, again, very rodent-like, real weird teeth, even for mammals. So that's how they get their name. Their teeth are very, very bumpy and have many more sort of, they're just fundamentally structured very differently than modern mammal teeth are. They hang around for a really long time.
How long is a really long time?
Let me actually look, because I don't know off the top of my head.
I love the click sound of keyboards on a podcast. There's something about it that I love.
It is much longer than I would have expected, because it is one of the first mammal groups to show up.
Mm-hmm.
So they show up in the early Jurassic and make it to the late Eocene. So that is approximately 166 million years or so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So extremely successful group. Just because a group is not around today does not mean that it was not very, very successful. This group was around for longer than, almost longer than dinosaurs. Besides sans birds. But yeah, it's crazy how long these things were around. And they're also real weird. But we will talk about them when we talk about sort of from the first mammals to current mammals. Because we will.
So is this kind of like a previewing an eventual part 2 to the mammal episode?
It absolutely is.
So should I title this episode Mammals Part 1? What should the title of this episode be, Gavin?
Let's see. From fish to mammals.
From fish to mammals. All right.
Or Mammal Origins. Something to that effect.
I can play it around with that. So is there anything else to add on to the Mammal Origins podcast?
I don't think so. Like I said, there are many different definitions for mammals that people have given over the years that we will cover in that part 2. But it's really interesting just to think of all of the different pieces that make mammals weird, because that's a really interesting point that I didn't really have in the notes that I'm really glad that you brought up, was like, are mammals the weird ones?
Yes.
Because we tend to think mammals are the norm because, we're them. But no, mammals are in fact the weird ones.
Yeah.
Even just like statistically, because mammals, while there are a lot of mammals, there's easily more birds than there are mammals, easily more lizards than there are mammals. There's probably more mammals than snakes. but there's also a lot of snakes. And crocodilians, there's not a whole lot of them, but they're still really, really widespread and still very successful. So they all have many things in common. So it's just like if you were to statistically pick a tetrapod and pick its features, you'd get a reptile. So
Mm-hmm.
mammals are the weird offshoot, you know?
That is, like you said, that is weird to think about, though, just because, we are mammals. We consider ourselves the default, and yet evolutionarily, not really.
Right. And that's not to say that there aren't lots and lots of weird reptiles as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but again, just statistically, we're the oddballs.
Oh, we're the maybe that'll be the title of this episode. We're the oddballs. Well, regardless of what I ended up titling this has been episode 35 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Gavin, you and I are both mammals, and we will see you next week.